The ballroom shimmered with warm, golden light, casting a glow over the gathered guests as the newlyweds swayed in the center of the dance floor. Ophelia leaned into Calloway, her head resting lightly against his chest, his steady heartbeat grounding her in the moment. She had spent years navigating life alone, keeping her emotions in check, always making decisions that prioritized stability over sentiment. But tonight, she had allowed herself to believe in happiness, to trust that love didn't always have to be fleeting. Calloway held her close, his grip firm but gentle, as though he understood how unfamiliar it was for her to lean on someone. He had been patient, persistent, kind, never pushing, always present. A contractor by trade, he built homes with his hands, but with her, he had built something much greater, a feeling of safety she hadn't realized she had been missing. The music softened, and a server passed by with a silver tray of champagne flutes. Calloway reached for 2 glasses, handing one to Ophelia as the guests clapped in admiration. A photographer caught the moment, her dark curls tumbling over one shoulder, his easy smile crinkling the corners of his bright green eyes. They looked like 2 people who had won something against impossible odds. A few feet away, Elio sat at a round table with a napkin tucked into the collar of his tiny button-down shirt. He was only 6 but had already perfected the art of sophisticated boredom. He twirled a breadstick between his fingers, ignoring the gentle attempts of an older woman to engage him in conversation. Ophelia had spent the early years of motherhood making peace with the fact that she and Elio were a unit, just the 2 of them. No father to step in during bedtime stories, no extra set of hands to help carry groceries up the stairs. She had long ago abandoned the fantasy of a traditional family, until Calloway walked into her life, appending her expectations with his quiet devotion. He hadn't just loved her, he had loved Elio, too, without hesitation. Calloway cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to him. His grip tightened slightly around her waist. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. Ophelia lifted her eyes to his, searching for a trace of humor, some indication that he was leading into an offbeat wedding toast. Instead, she found something else, an edge of nervousness, something uncharacteristic, something unsettling. She smiled lightly, playing along, assuming whatever it was could wait until they were alone. "You're already married, aren't you?" she teased, keeping her tone light. Calloway didn't smile. The music shifted to a livelier tune as more guests moved onto the dance floor. Ophelia barely noticed. "What is it?" she asked, voice quieter now. He exhaled, looking at her as though trying to memorize every feature, as though bracing for the impact of whatever was about to come. "I should have told you sooner," he began, his hand warm against her back. "But I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have." Something in her chest tightened. "Calloway," she said, an unspoken plea in his name. "I'm not just a contractor," he admitted, his words slow and deliberate. "I own the company. A very successful company." The words landed awkwardly between them, heavy and unexpected. Ophelia stared at him, her pulse quickening. This wasn't nothing, but it wasn't devastating either. It wasn't as though she had married a stranger. He was still Calloway, the man who insisted on carrying her groceries even when she insisted she could do it herself, the man who had once spent an entire afternoon fixing her kitchen sink even though he had a dozen employees who could have done it for him. She swallowed, adjusting to the news in real time. "So, you're successful," she said carefully, as if repeating the information might help her process it. He nodded, holding her gaze. "Yes." Something about the way he said it made her stomach turn. There was more. And she knew, instinctively, that the next thing he said would change everything. Calloway inhaled, his grip on her waist firm. "That's not all." A flicker of alarm moved through her. The music, the laughter, the hum of conversation, it all faded to a distant murmur. "I just found out a few weeks ago," he said, his voice uneven now. "I didn't know before. I swear to you, Ophelia, I had no idea." She had no words. Only fear now. He glanced toward Elio, then back at her. Ophelia, he said, voice tight. I'm his father. Her breath caught, and the room tilted. She blinked, trying to make sense of the words, but they made no sense. Not even close. No. That wasn't possible. She shook her head, confusion cutting through her like ice. No, she whispered, searching his face, desperate for an explanation that made sense. Calloway held steady, not looking away. I swear, I didn't know, he repeated, urgency in his tone. Not until recently. She stepped back, a wave of nausea rolling over her. The air in the room felt too thick, the walls too close. How, was all she managed. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of distress. Remember the night we talked about? The one neither of us really remembers? She did. Years ago. A single night. A moment in time she had long since let go of. It had been after a friend's wedding, long before they met again under different circumstances. That night had felt disconnected from the rest of her life, a small, blurred piece of history she had never given much thought to. And now, he was saying, what? That it hadn't been insignificant at all? She couldn't breathe. Calloway stepped toward her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. No, she whispered again, because if she said it enough times, maybe it wouldn't be real. But it was. It was real. The reception around them carried on, oblivious to the earthquake taking place between them. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, the soft hum of music, it all felt surreal, like a cruel joke. Elio, their son, her son, sat at the table, blissfully unaware that his world had just changed forever. Calloway reached for her, eyes pleading. I love you. I love him. I don't want this to change anything. But how could it not? Ophelia could hear her own breathing, shallow and uneven, over the hum of the wedding reception. The walls of the ballroom felt like they were closing in, the chandelier lights too bright, the music too loud. Her fingers clenched the delicate lace of her wedding dress, as if holding on to something solid could keep her from spiraling. Calloway was still standing in front of her, his expression raw with unspoken pleas. I didn't know, I swear. His voice echoed in her head, but she couldn't process it, couldn't wrap her mind around what had just happened. How could this be real? Elio. Her Elio. Their Elio. Her stomach twisted. The ground beneath her heels felt uneven. She wasn't sure if she was going to faint, throw up, or start laughing hysterically at the absurdity of it all. Maybe she'd do all three at once. That would certainly make an impression. The room hadn't gone completely silent, but there was a shift, a ripple of unease. People were still drinking, still dancing, still locked in conversations, but those closest to them, family, friends, the nosy distant relatives, were watching. She could feel their curiosity, their questions forming before they even had time to process what they had just overheard. Had they overheard? Or had the sheer force of her shock been enough to tell them that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong? A laugh burst from her lips, sharp and involuntary. It wasn't amusement. It was the sheer absurdity of standing in her own wedding dress, champagne in hand, being told that the man she had just married was the father of the child she had raised alone. She didn't even realize she had taken a step back until Calloway reached out as if to steady her. His touch jolted her back into the present, back into the mess she was standing in. Ophelia. Stop, she whispered, shaking her head. If he said anything else, she might actually lose her grip on reality. Her thoughts were racing too fast for her to catch them. She wanted to be anywhere but here. She wanted to take Elio and run, pretend none of this was happening. She turned slightly and made the mistake of meeting the eyes of the guests at the closest tables. Confusion. Suspicion. Eagerness. Weddings had a way of making people feel personally invested, as if the lives of the bride and groom were a public spectacle, something to be watched and consumed like a well-crafted film. But this wasn't entertainment. This was her life, breaking apart in real time. A few people whispered behind napkins, others exchanged glances. Ophelia's best friend, Vesper, was at the far end of the room, half standing, her brows furrowed in concern. She looked ready to storm over and demand an explanation or whisk Ophelia away before things got worse. It was a tempting thought. Aunt Marian, whose entire personality revolved around collecting and spreading family gossip, was already clutching her husband's arm, her expression lighting up with intrigue. If Ophelia didn't get a hold of herself, this story would be retold at every holiday gathering for the next 10 years. Then there was Elio, still sitting at the children's table, completely unaware. He was laughing at something one of the other kids had said, dunking a piece of bread into his soup like nothing in the world had changed. Calloway was speaking again, his voice softer, urgent, but Ophelia couldn't focus. Her gaze had moved past the well-meaning guests and the nosy ones and landed on Ianthe. Ianthe, with her elegant posture, her dark green gown tailored to perfection, her expression unreadable but undeniably sharp. While everyone else seemed caught between confusion and concern, she was still. Unmoved. Watching. Of course she already knew. Ophelia's heart pounded harder at the realization. Ianthe knew, and she had chosen to say nothing. Not before the wedding, not even after. She had let Ophelia walk down the aisle in ignorance, had let this moment unfold exactly as it had. And why? To test her? To see how she would react? To watch her unravel? Ophelia wasn't sure if she was angrier at Calloway or at his mother. Calloway, at least, looked stricken. He had meant for this to come from a place of love, of wanting to be honest before they started their life together. Ianthe, however, had simply let it happen. And now she was watching, as if this was the real event she had been waiting for. A waiter, oblivious to the tension thick enough to slice through, appeared at their side, smiling warmly. "Would you like another drink?" Ophelia nearly laughed again. God, yes. She needed something stronger than champagne. But instead of answering, she waved him off with a quick shake of her head. She turned back to Calloway. His face was so open, so desperate for her to understand, but all she could think about was the weight of everything that had just changed. "Why now?" she finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why not before the wedding? Why not before you proposed? Before I let myself believe this was real?" He exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping. "I was afraid of losing you." Her throat tightened. The irony of it. "And now? I still am." The reception carried on, the music swelling again, the conversations shifting, but Ophelia stood there, frozen. Somewhere in the distance, Elio's laughter rang out. She had no idea what to do. Ophelia had met Calloway in the least romantic way possible, trapped outside her apartment building, balancing 3 bags of groceries, a restless 5-year-old, and a key that refused to turn in the lock. The day had already been a disaster. Her boss had given her extra shifts without asking, Elio had spilled juice all over his only clean school uniform, and now, of course, the lock was staging a personal attack. Calloway had been working on renovations in the building across the street, standing near a truck, talking with his crew. She had noticed him before, but in the way a person notices a particularly well-kept tree or an oddly satisfying street lamp, appreciative, but indifferent. That changed when he crossed the street, toolbox in hand, and said, "I can fix that." She should have been suspicious. What kind of man approached a stranger and offered to fix her front door like it was the most natural thing in the world? She didn't have time to argue, though, because Elio had started dramatically sighing about being hungry, and Calloway had already knelt by the lock, inspecting it like he had a personal vendetta against cheap apartment hardware. "This building was slapped together with spare parts," he muttered. "You say that like you know it personally," she shot back. He glanced up, smiling. I do. I worked on it 6 years ago. Her stomach flipped, but she ignored it. She had gotten very good at ignoring unnecessary feelings. A few turns of a screwdriver later, the lock clicked open. Elio threw his arms in the air. Finally. I'm starving. Ophelia gave Calloway a look that was half grateful, half skeptical. What do I owe you? He leaned against the doorframe. Dinner. Her eyebrows shot up. That's bold. You have to feed the kid anyway, he said with a shrug. Might as well make enough for two. She could have said no. She should have said no. But Elio had already run inside, and she was too tired to argue. Calloway had stayed for dinner. And then he kept coming back. It wasn't a grand love story, but it was real. He never swooped in with promises to fix everything, never made her feel like she owed him anything. He just showed up. Again and again. He learned how Ophelia took her coffee, that she pretended to like documentaries even though she always fell asleep 10 minutes in, that she hated the smell of vanilla-scented candles. He let Elio talk endlessly about dinosaurs and never corrected him when he got the names wrong. He became something steady in their lives, something she hadn't realized she was allowed to want. He had been so simple, so certain, so utterly unbothered by the fact that she came as a package deal. That had been enough. Until now. Now, she was staring at him across a wedding reception, realizing that even the simplest love stories could hold complicated truths. Calloway wasn't just a contractor. He wasn't just the man who had made her feel safe. He was a man who had built a company from nothing, a man with a family legacy she knew nothing about, a man who had somehow been part of her past without either of them knowing. She thought about the way he never seemed stressed about money, the way he never hesitated to pick up the check, how he had never once seemed concerned about rent or bills or anything else that consumed her daily life. She had assumed he was just responsible, that he had a steady business. She had never imagined he was running an empire of his own. The pieces started fitting together in ways she didn't like. The fact that his work truck was always spotless, like he didn't really need to use it. The way he had once casually mentioned owning rental properties but hadn't elaborated. The time she had seen his name on the side of a building downtown and assumed it was a coincidence. Ophelia had spent years being practical, careful. She had grown up believing in romance, but reality had beaten the fantasy out of her by the time she was 21. She had been young, in love, and incredibly naive when she first found out she was pregnant. Elio's father had been everything she had thought she wanted, charming, spontaneous, full of grand plans that never quite materialized. He had kissed her on sidewalks, spun her around in grocery store aisles, made her feel like life was something to be celebrated. But when she told him about the baby, he had gone quiet. Then, he had gone completely. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fights, no screaming matches. Just a slow unraveling of communication, missed calls, messages left unread. He had faded out of her life like an old photograph, and she had let him. She had been terrified, but she hadn't fallen apart. She had Elio. And when you had a child depending on you, you didn't get the luxury of breaking down. You figured it out. She worked double shifts, learned how to fix things in her apartment when they broke, became an expert at stretching a paycheck. She had built a life, a solid, simple life. And then Calloway had come along and made it even better. But now, as she stood there, absorbing everything he had just told her, she felt like she was looking at a stranger. You lied to me, she had said earlier, and he had flinched. I didn't lie, he had argued. I just didn't tell you everything. The distinction felt thin, unsteady. Her life had been built on surviving, on preparing for disappointment before it arrived. Calloway had been the one thing that felt different, like something she could finally lean on. And now, even that felt uncertain. She looked past him, her gaze landing on Ianthe, sitting with the perfect posture of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Ianthe, who clearly knew everything before Ophelia did. Who had probably been waiting for this moment, waiting to see how Ophelia would react. Calloway had always said she didn't need to worry about his mother. That he had made his own choices, built his own life. But how much of that was true? And how much of it was just a story he had told himself? She thought of Elio, of the little boy she had raised alone, of the years she had spent worrying about whether she was doing enough, whether he would ever feel like he was missing something. He hadn't been missing something. He had been missing someone. She didn't know what to do with that. Calloway was still looking at her, waiting. She had no idea what to say. Calloway was talking, but Ophelia could barely hear him over the pounding in her ears. The words were coming out in a rush, carefully measured but still frantic, as if the faster he spoke, the sooner he could make it all make sense. "I only realized it a few weeks ago," he said, voice low, eyes locked on hers, like he could hold her there if he just focused hard enough. "I swear, Ophelia, I didn't know. I never would have kept something like this from you." She folded her arms across her stomach, feeling unsteady, unsure. "How? How could you not know?" Calloway ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I remembered that night, the wedding, the way we left separately. I thought it was a one-time thing, something that just existed in the past. And then I met you again years later, and it never even crossed my mind that Elio..." He paused, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe it himself. "I didn't put it together until I saw a picture of him when he was a baby. And then it hit me all at once. He looks like my sister did when she was little. He has my grandmother's eyes." Ophelia flinched. She had spent years looking at Elio's face, wondering if he would ever ask questions about his father, if he would feel that absence the way she had tried to shield him from. The idea that someone else had looked at him and seen their own reflection was suddenly unbearable. "You should have told me the moment you figured it out." "I know. You let me marry you without telling me." His jaw tightened. "Because I wanted you to love me for me. I was afraid if I told you, you'd think it changed everything." She let out a sharp laugh. "Of course it changes everything." Calloway took a step closer, his voice softer now. "I love you. I love him. This doesn't change that." She stepped back. "But it does." The reception around them continued as if nothing was happening. Guests still chatted and clinked glasses. A waiter slipped past with a tray of desserts. Elio sat with his cousins, happily spooning frosting off a cupcake, completely unaware that his world had just shifted beneath him. Ophelia had been alone when she found out she was pregnant. No romantic declarations, no promises of commitment. Just a long night of staring at a cheap apartment ceiling, calculating rent, calculating formula costs, wondering how much longer she could work double shifts before her body gave out. She had done everything alone. And now, in an instant, she wasn't. She hated that she didn't know how to feel about that. Calloway was still looking at her, waiting for her to say something that she couldn't even begin to form into words. And then, as if the moment wasn't already unbearable, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Ianthe. She was standing near the bar, watching. Of course she was. She had probably been watching all night, waiting for the moment when the cracks would start to show. Ophelia had always been wary of Calloway's mother. She was polite in the way women who never had to try to be liked were polite, smiling just enough, saying the right words, never once making you feel warm. There was an art to her kind of cruelty, and Ophelia had recognized it immediately. Now, Ianthe approached, slow and graceful, like a queen stepping into a room full of subjects. "Ophelia," she said smoothly. "A lovely reception." Ophelia tightened her grip around the stem of her champagne glass, waiting. Calloway stiffened beside her. "Mother." Ianthe held up a hand, her rings catching the light. "I would like a moment with my daughter-in-law. If you don't mind, Calloway." He hesitated, looking at Ophelia like he didn't want to leave, but Ianthe didn't move until he finally, reluctantly, stepped away. The moment he was out of earshot, Ianthe let out a soft sigh, like she was already exhausted by whatever came next. "I assume you're upset," she said. Ophelia stared at her. Brilliant deduction. Ianthe ignored the sarcasm. "You're a smart woman. I'm sure you've already figured out that my son is impulsive." Ophelia bristled. "He always has been," Ianthe continued, examining the rim of her wine glass. "Rushing into things without thinking, getting caught up in the moment, making decisions based on feelings rather than logic." "Funny," Ophelia said tightly. "I always thought that was a good thing." A small smile, brief but sharp. "Of course you did." There it was. The real Ianthe, peeking through the carefully controlled mask. "You don't approve of me," Ophelia said bluntly. "You never have." Ianthe's smile didn't falter. "Approval is irrelevant now, don't you think? You're already married. And yet." She tilted her head slightly. "I do wonder how much thought you've given to what that means." Ophelia swallowed hard. "Meaning?" "My son has built a good life for himself," Ianthe said. "But it isn't separate from us. No matter how much he may want to believe it, he's still part of something much larger. And that something does not tolerate disorder." A slow chill crept up Ophelia's spine. "You may believe that he has chosen you," Ianthe went on, voice perfectly even. "But I assure you, when it comes down to it, my son will always do what is expected of him." Ophelia's throat tightened. "And what is that?" Ianthe sipped her wine. "He'll do what's right. Even if it means leaving." The words weren't loud. They weren't sharp. But they cut straight through her. Ophelia had spent years telling herself she didn't need anyone. That she and Elio were enough. And then Calloway had come along, and for the first time in years, she had let herself believe in something else. Now, for the first time since the wedding began, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The house was too perfect. That was the problem. Ophelia had never lived anywhere perfect before. She had spent years in apartments where the floors creaked like they were groaning under the weight of existence, where pipes rattled and water pressure was an unpredictable gamble. She had become accustomed to kitchen drawers that never quite shut all the way, to windows that needed to be jiggled into place before they'd lock, to carpets that carried the history of every tenant who had walked on them before her. But this house had heated floors. Every cabinet door shut with an almost unsettling smoothness, the kind of seamless, whisper-quiet movement that made her irrationally suspicious. The walls were spotless, waiting for personal touches she hadn't decided if she wanted to make. The windows overlooked a view that didn't belong to her, a wide, sprawling backyard that stretched into rolling hills, too picturesque to be real. She didn't know how to belong in a place like this. Calloway had been setting up his study while she unpacked in the bedroom, but after an hour of staring at her half-empty suitcase, she had given up and wandered through the house instead. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, maybe proof that this was really hers, that it wasn't something temporary, something that would slip through her fingers before she had time to claim it. The door to his study was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open without thinking. His desk was neat, papers stacked in precise piles, a few pens placed at perfect right angles. Calloway wasn't obsessive about order, but he liked structure, liked things exactly where they belonged. She traced her fingers along the polished surface, trailing the edges, grounding herself in the space. Then she saw the drawer. It was flush with the desk, barely noticeable, but when she tried to pull it open, it didn't budge. Locked. Which was ridiculous. She stared at it for a moment, debating. A locked drawer was not normal. This wasn't a hotel safe or a bank vault. It was his desk in their home. Her stomach twisted. She checked the top drawers, rifled through neatly arranged office supplies and business cards. Then, at the very back, she found a small key. Her hand shook as she slid it into the lock. The drawer clicked open. Inside was a folder, thick and heavy, tucked beneath a few irrelevant documents. The moment she pulled it out, she felt it, that awful, instinctual certainty that whatever she was about to see was going to ruin her. She unfolded the papers. At the top, in clear, bold print, were the words marriage agreement. Her breath caught. She scanned the document, eyes darting over the legal jargon, catching only the parts that mattered. If the marriage ended within 12 months, Ophelia would receive a small financial settlement. Calloway, in return, would gain full control of the family business. A low buzzing sound filled her ears. She read it again. And again. Her hands curled into fists around the paper. She didn't remember walking to find Calloway. Didn't remember calling his name, only that suddenly she was standing in the hallway, her chest rising and falling in sharp, unsteady bursts, her hand clutching the contract so tightly the edges had started to bend. He turned from where he had been unpacking a box near the bookshelves, smiling at her in a way that suggested he had no idea his entire world was about to go up in flames. Her voice was colder than she meant it to be. "What is this?" Calloway took one look at the document in her hands, and every ounce of warmth drained from his face. "Ophelia." She held up the paper between them. "I found this in your desk." The locked drawer. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I was going to tell you." "Oh, were you? When, exactly?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Maybe on our 1-year anniversary? You could have given it to me with a cake." "Ophelia, please. Don't." She didn't want please. She wanted answers. His jaw tensed, hands on his hips, a man who had just been caught in something awful and was trying to figure out how to fix it. "It wasn't my choice," he said finally. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. "So someone else wrote up a contract about our marriage?" "My mother," he admitted, and it was almost worse. Her stomach twisted again, deeper this time, more painful. "This is her? She didn't trust you." He let out a breath, looking away, shoulders stiff. "She didn't trust me either. She wanted a guarantee that I wasn't marrying you just to run from the company, and that you weren't marrying me for money." She had nothing. No words. No breath. "You weren't supposed to find that," he added. "God, listen to yourself," she snapped. "You're not even apologizing. You're just mad that I found out." Calloway took a step toward her, but she stepped back, because if he touched her, she might actually break. "I didn't sign it because I agreed with it," he said, voice tight. "I signed it because if I didn't, she would have made your life hell. More than she already has. And I knew, no matter what, I wasn't going to use it." Ophelia swallowed, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Then why keep it?" Calloway hesitated. That pause, that awful, heavy pause, was what did it. Because it meant that at some point, some deep and terrible point, he had considered it. Maybe not seriously. Maybe not fully. But he had thought about it enough to keep it locked away, hidden. Her fingers loosened, the contract slipping from her hands onto the floor between them. "Ophelia," he said softly. "Please. This doesn't mean what you think it does." But what else could it mean? Her throat was tight, heart hammering against her ribs. "I need space." Calloway flinched. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." And that was the truth. She didn't know anything anymore. Calloway's hands curled into fists at his sides. He had never looked at her with fear before. But he was looking at her like that now. "Ophelia. I need time, Calloway." She turned before he could say anything else. She walked out of the room, out of the perfect house, past the boxes of things that were supposed to belong to them. She needed to breathe. And right now, she couldn't do that here. Vesper opened the door in an old college sweatshirt and a pair of mismatched socks, blinking at Ophelia like she had just appeared out of thin air. Do I even need to ask? Ophelia shook her head, gripping the handle of her suitcase in one hand and balancing Elio on her hip with the other. She hadn't even realized she had come straight here until she was standing on Vesper's porch, until the streetlights flickered on and made the whole thing feel like some dramatic scene out of a movie. Vesper sighed and stepped aside. Get in here. Elio was already half asleep by the time she set him down in Vesper's guest room, his tiny fists curled into the pillow, blissfully unaware that his mother's entire life had just exploded. She sat at the kitchen counter, staring at the glass of wine Vesper had put in front of her like it might hold answers. I don't even know what I'm doing here. Vesper raised an eyebrow. That's a lie. She let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers against her temples. I found a contract. A legal agreement. If we get divorced within a year, I get a check and Calloway gets control of his family's business. Vesper was silent for a beat. Then she whistled low. That is impressively terrible. Ophelia let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Vesper grabbed her own glass and took a long sip. Okay, so let's go through this logically. Did he sign it because he wanted to? Or because his mother made him? He says she forced him. And do you believe him? Ophelia hesitated. Vesper didn't push. She just nodded like that was answer enough. The doorbell rang. Ophelia froze. Vesper glanced toward the door. Expecting someone? A slow, sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She wasn't expecting anyone. Vesper stood, moving toward the door with the casual ease of someone who had no idea what kind of person might be standing on the other side. She peered through the peephole, then turned back, expression unreadable. You're not going to like this. Ophelia didn't need to ask. Ianthe. She let out a slow, measured breath before getting up and walking to the door. Vesper stepped aside, arms crossed, watching like she was prepared to throw a punch if necessary. Ianthe stood on the porch in an elegant navy coat, her hair swept into a perfect chignon, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that she was standing outside a small, slightly messy bungalow that did not, in any way, fit into her world. She offered a polite smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Ophelia. Ianthe. I'd like to speak with you. Ophelia glanced at Vesper. Vesper shrugged. Your funeral. Ianthe stepped inside, moving with the air of someone who was used to being welcomed into places that weren't hers. She took a slow look around before settling her gaze back on Ophelia. I understand you've left Calloway. Ophelia's hands curled into fists. I didn't leave him. I needed time. Ianthe hummed. Is that what we're calling it? Vesper made a choking noise that might have been a laugh. Ianthe ignored her. I want to make this easy for you. Ophelia exhaled sharply. How thoughtful. Ianthe pulled a sleek envelope from her coat and placed it on the counter. I'm offering you exactly what the contract states. If you walk away now, you will have financial security for the rest of your life. You and your son. Ophelia didn't touch the envelope. You're a practical woman, Ianthe continued, like she was explaining simple math. Why would you stay married to someone who has already proven he keeps secrets? Someone who knew exactly what he was walking into and still chose to sign that agreement. Ophelia's stomach twisted. She hated that part of her brain had already been whispering these things. That the voice of doubt was creeping in, long before Ianthe had walked through the door. Ianthe smoothed her coat. Calloway will always choose what is best for the family's company. And no matter how much he tells himself that's you, it never has been. He married you to appear stable to investors. You were convenient. A perfect image. A solid, responsible family man. Do you really believe he chose you over them? Ophelia's chest tightened. She had always believed Calloway was different from his family. That he had built something of his own, walked away from their influence, forged his own path. But was that really true? Or had he just been waiting for the right opportunity to be pulled back in? Vesper cleared her throat, arms still crossed, watching the entire thing with something between mild amusement and growing concern. You're saying she was convenient? Ianthe didn't even blink. Yes. Vesper let out a slow whistle. Hate to break it to you, but I don't think that's how love works. Ianthe turned back to Ophelia, ignoring her. Ophelia forced herself to meet her gaze. He said you made him sign it. Ianthe's smile was small, almost amused. And you believe that? She had. But now? Now she wasn't sure of anything. Ianthe gave her a long look before gesturing toward the envelope. It's your choice, of course. She turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to offer one last, parting remark. But if you don't take it now, she said, voice smooth, don't expect it to still be an option later. The door clicked shut behind her. Ophelia stared at the envelope. Vesper picked it up, waved it in the air, then tossed it onto the counter. Well, she said, grabbing her wine. That was fun. Ophelia sat down hard in the chair, head in her hands. Vesper nudged her foot under the table. Hey. Don't let her mess with you. She's not wrong, Ophelia murmured. About what? Ophelia swallowed hard. What if he did marry me for appearances? Vesper studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. Ophelia, Calloway isn't his mother. And you know that. She did. But doubt was a quiet, patient thing. And right now, it was growing. Calloway sat across from Ophelia at Vesper's kitchen table, his hands clasped together like he was holding on to something invisible, something slipping through his fingers. He looked exhausted. Not just from lack of sleep, but from everything. From them. From whatever war he had been fighting long before she had stepped into it. Ophelia had spent the last few days convincing herself she was done listening. That nothing he could say would matter. But now, here he was, looking at her like she was the only person in the world he needed to understand him. She hated that it still mattered to her. She folded her arms. Start talking. Calloway inhaled slowly, gathering himself. I left my family's business years ago, he said. You know that much. She nodded stiffly. That was one of the things she had liked about him. That he hadn't just inherited his success, that he had built something with his own hands. I walked away because I didn't agree with how they operated, he continued, his voice steady but strained. It wasn't just about the money or the industry. It was about how they did things. The choices they made. The people they stepped on. I didn't want any part of it. Ophelia narrowed her eyes. So you built your own company to prove you didn't need them? He hesitated, then nodded. At first. But then it became more than that. I wanted something real. Something I could be proud of. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. And for a while, I thought they had accepted it. That they had written me off and moved on. But they didn't. They were just waiting. A slow, creeping feeling spread through Ophelia's chest. Waiting for what? Calloway met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. For you. Her stomach dropped. What are you talking about? He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. When we got serious, when I told them I was going to marry you, everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't just the son who walked away. I was an asset again. Because being married, having a family, made me look like the right kind of leader. The stable one. The one investors would trust. Ophelia's throat tightened. Calloway ran a hand through his hair. They think they can bring me back in. That I'll come home and take over. And they're using you to do it. She shook her head, trying to process it. That doesn't even make sense. I'm the reason you left in the first place. Exactly, he said. And now, they think you're the reason I'll come back. Ophelia pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. She couldn't sit still. Couldn't breathe. So what? I'm just some kind of bargaining chip. A strategy? To them? Maybe. His voice was low. But not to me. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, her thoughts unraveling faster than she could hold on to them. God, I knew your mother hated me, but I didn't think she was actually planning anything. Calloway exhaled. She always plans. Ophelia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. And you were just going to let me walk into all of this blind? Of course not. But you didn't tell me. She turned back to him, her voice sharp, cracking at the edges. You should have told me from the beginning. Calloway's jaw clenched. And would you have stayed if I had? She opened her mouth. Closed it. She didn't have an answer for that. He exhaled, his voice softer now. I was trying to protect you. She let out another hollow laugh, pressing her fingers to her temples. God, men always say that like it's somehow not the most condescending thing in the world. He flinched. Ophelia. Do you even hear yourself? She turned, pacing now, the anger bubbling up, spilling over. You made a decision for me. You decided what I needed to know, what I didn't. You thought I'd be safer in the dark. You don't get to do that. I know. His voice was quiet, wrecked. I know, and I'm sorry. But there's something else. She stopped. What now? He swallowed hard. My mother has been interfering in your life for longer than you think. The words landed like a slap. What does that mean? Calloway hesitated. Remember that job you almost got? The one that was suddenly no longer available? She stared at him. Yes. That wasn't bad luck, he said carefully. She made sure they pulled the offer. Ophelia went still. And the apartment you applied for, he continued. The one that got denied at the last second? That was her, too. A sharp, icy rage flooded her veins. No. No, that wasn't possible. Her mind reeled, flipping through memories, through all the things that had gone wrong at exactly the worst moments. She had spent years thinking she was unlucky, thinking the world just had a personal grudge against single mothers, that maybe if she had worked harder, tried harder, things wouldn't have been so difficult. But it wasn't bad luck. It was Ianthe. She had done this to her. Ophelia's hands shook. How long have you known? His silence was enough of an answer. Her breath caught, something hot and raw clawing its way up her throat. How much of my life was because of her? Calloway's shoulders dropped. I don't know. You don't know? Her voice was rising now, and she didn't care. Calloway, I spent years thinking I was barely holding on because of me. Because I just wasn't good enough, or smart enough, or lucky enough. But it was her. She made sure I couldn't move forward. I know, he said, voice rough. And I hate it. I hate her for it. But I'm telling you now because I won't let her do it anymore. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to breathe, trying to keep herself from screaming. Calloway's mother had stolen years from her. Years of struggling, of wondering what was wrong with her when all along, the world had been rigged against her. She looked at Calloway, really looked at him. The man she had fallen in love with. The man who had made her believe in something again. And suddenly, she didn't know if she could trust him at all. Calloway stood in Ophelia's kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands gripping the edge of the counter like he needed to physically hold on to something. He had shown up unannounced, looking like he hadn't slept in days, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else, something more fragile. Ophelia had half a mind to tell him to leave. To remind him that just because she had let him explain didn't mean she was ready to forgive. But then he had said the words she hadn't been expecting. I don't want to be them. She had spent so much time being angry at him, at the secrets, at the way her entire past had been twisted by forces she hadn't even known existed. But in that moment, looking at him, she realized he was just as much a casualty of Ianthe as she was. I hate what she's done to you, he said. What she's done to me. And I hate that I let it happen. Ophelia's grip tightened around the dish towel in her hands. She had spent years fighting against invisible barriers, never realizing who was behind them. But Calloway had always known who was pulling his strings, and still, somehow, he had let her win. Do you? She asked, her voice quiet. Hate it enough to walk away? Calloway exhaled sharply. I already did. She shook her head. No, you left. That's not the same thing. He looked at her, searching for something in her face, something that could tell him what he was supposed to say. She didn't have the answer for him. Elio's voice drifted in from the other room, humming a tune to himself while he stacked his toy cars in some intricate, highly specific order. A part of her wanted to tell Calloway to leave, to go back to whatever battle he was fighting with his mother and sort it out on his own. But a bigger part of her was tired. Tired of fighting alone. You should stay for dinner, she said finally. Calloway blinked, clearly thrown by the shift in conversation. Are you sure? She wasn't. But Elio deserved some kind of normalcy, and honestly, she didn't have the energy to keep him away forever. Calloway nodded slowly, as if afraid to move too quickly, as if he knew he was being let in on borrowed time. He turned toward the cabinets. I can cook. Ophelia raised an eyebrow. Since when? He shot her a look. Since always. She crossed her arms, skeptical. Prove it. For the next hour, they weren't fighting. They were just two people in a kitchen, chopping vegetables, arguing about seasoning, laughing when Calloway very confidently insisted he knew how to flip a pan of sautéing mushrooms and then immediately dropped half of them on the floor. Elio ran in and out, oblivious to the tension that still lingered beneath the surface. It wasn't perfect. But it was something. Then the doorbell rang. Ophelia frowned, drying her hands on a dish towel. Vesper had a habit of dropping by unannounced, but she usually just let herself in. She opened the door and froze. The woman on the other side of the threshold was stunning. The kind of stunning that made Ophelia instantly self-conscious about the flour dusting the front of her sweater and the way her hair was barely holding onto its messy bun. She was tall, with sleek, dark hair and the kind of poise that suggested she had never tripped on a loose sidewalk brick in her life. Ophelia, is it? Her voice was warm, friendly even, but too perfect. Like it had been practiced. Ophelia hesitated. Yes? The woman smiled like they were already old friends. I'm Seraphine. The name settled into Ophelia's stomach like a stone. She didn't have to ask who she was. Ianthe's invitation was written all over her. Calloway appeared behind her, drying his hands with a dish towel. Seraphine? His voice was tense. Seraphine turned toward him, tilting her head with a soft, almost playful smirk. It's been a long time. Calloway didn't answer. Ophelia looked between them, something sharp and uncomfortable twisting inside her. Would someone like to explain why Calloway's ex is standing on my porch? Seraphine let out a light laugh, waving a hand. X makes it sound so dramatic. Ophelia gave her a flat look. Would you prefer woman Calloway was supposed to marry instead? Seraphine's smile didn't falter. That does have a nice ring to it. Ophelia's grip tightened around the dish towel. Calloway stepped beside her, shoulders stiff. Why are you here? Seraphine sighed, like this was all very inconvenient for her. Ianthe asked me to come. She thought it was time you remembered your responsibilities. Ophelia's stomach churned. Seraphine turned to her, voice smooth, calculated. You have to understand, Calloway and I were supposed to be a partnership. Not some flimsy romance. It was about legacy. About keeping power where it belongs. Ophelia's chest burned. Sounds deeply romantic. Seraphine smirked. Love isn't always the most practical option. Calloway's jaw was tight. What do you want, Seraphine? She sighed. I want you to think, Calloway. Ianthe isn't wrong. You've built something impressive, but the truth is, your family's company will always own a part of you. You can play house all you want, but eventually, you'll have to choose. Ophelia's fingers curled against her palms. Choose between what? Seraphine turned to her with something almost like pity. Between love and duty. Calloway exhaled sharply. I already made my choice. Seraphine tilted her head, examining him. Did you? Ophelia's stomach twisted. Seraphine gave her a long, deliberate look, voice dropping slightly. You may believe he loves you. And maybe he does. But he was raised for this. Trained for it. And when it comes down to it, men like Calloway always choose power over love. Ophelia's chest tightened. Seraphine smiled sympathetically. I just thought you should know before you learn the hard way. She turned, stepping off the porch like she had just delivered some great kindness. Calloway let out a breath, pressing his fingers to his temples. I swear to you, Ophelia, that's not. But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the space where Seraphine had stood. At the cracks in the foundation of everything she thought she knew. Calloway had left his family once. But could he ever really leave? The invitation arrived on thick, ivory paper, hand-delivered in an envelope that bore no return address but smelled faintly of Ianthe's perfume. Calloway should have ignored it. Should have tossed it in the fireplace, watched the edges curl and blacken, let the whole thing turn to ash. Instead, he found himself standing outside a private club, the kind where power changed hands over old whiskey and quiet nods. He had spent his whole life trying to escape rooms like this, but now, as the heavy doors swung open, he realized he had never really left. The board members were already seated when he entered, a row of tailored suits and cool, measured expressions. They didn't greet him like a long-lost son. They didn't greet him at all. At the center of the table, his father's chair sat conspicuously empty. A reminder. Ianthe was the only one who acknowledged him. She smiled slightly, not warm, not welcoming, just pleased that he had come. Sit, Calloway, one of the older men said, gesturing to the open chair at the head of the table. His seat. The one that, by all logic, should have been his years ago. Calloway sat. No small talk. No pleasantries. Just the offer. You built something impressive, another board member said, voice smooth, rehearsed. But you don't have to do it alone. This company was always meant to be yours. It still can be. Calloway's fingers curled into his palms. There's a catch. Ianthe exhaled delicately, as if the whole thing bored her. You already know what it is. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. We've reviewed the situation, another man said. And we're prepared to grant you full control of the company, effective immediately. Calloway kept his face blank. And? You sever ties with your wife, the man said, like he was discussing a simple transaction, a matter of numbers, not a human being. Cleanly. No scandal, no emotion. A swift, efficient annulment. His stomach twisted. It's the right move, Ianthe said smoothly. She'll be taken care of course. A generous settlement. Discreet. Respectable. Calloway's pulse hammered in his ears. He knew this moment was coming. Of course he did. The deal he had spent years thinking he wanted. The throne they were offering him, not because they respected him, but because he had something they needed, an image, a presence, a name they could mold back into something useful. And all he had to do was give up the only thing in his life that had ever felt real. He could walk out of here as the man he had been raised to be. He could sit at this table and take the empire they had built for him. Or he could walk away. Again. Ianthe watched him, calm, collected, already knowing what he would do before he did. He had spent his whole life proving to her that he wasn't weak. That he wasn't soft. That he was worthy of the name she had given him. And yet, his mother had made a career out of bending people to her will. But she had never met Ophelia. He stood. Slowly. Deliberately. "No," he said. The room was silent. Ianthe raised an eyebrow. "No?" "You heard me," he said, voice steady. "I'm not taking the deal. I'm not giving up my marriage." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat. "Calloway, think rationally." "I am." His mother didn't speak. Didn't argue. Didn't fight. She simply folded her hands in front of her and said, "You'll regret this." The words were quiet. Not a threat. Not a promise. Just a fact. Calloway turned and walked out. The empire was never his. And now, it never would be. By the next morning, the destruction had already begun. His company's stock plummeted. Calls from investors went unanswered. Contracts that had been locked in for months were suddenly gone. By noon, half of his biggest investors had pulled out. By evening, the rest followed. By midnight, his name was being whispered in boardrooms, no longer as a potential heir, but as a warning. Calloway spent the next 48 hours making phone calls that led to nowhere, watching his company, his real company, the one he had built from nothing, fall apart in real time. And there was only one person who could have orchestrated it. Ianthe didn't raise her voice. She didn't make public declarations. She simply removed the ground beneath his feet and waited for him to fall. Calloway sat on the edge of the motel bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the air smelled faintly of bleach and something fried, but at least it was quiet. Ophelia stood near the window, arms crossed, watching him. "You look like hell." He let out a humorless laugh. "Feels about right." There had been a time, not long ago, when the thought of losing his business would have sent him into a panic. When walking away from everything he had built would have felt like suffocating. But now, looking at her, knowing she was still standing here, that was the only thing that mattered. She leaned against the windowsill, watching the dim lights of the parking lot flicker. "You're not going to fix it, are you?" He exhaled. "No." Ophelia nodded slowly. "Good." He lifted his head. "Good." She shrugged. "Calloway, I never loved you for your money." His chest tightened. "I mean, I figured you were doing well," she continued, still looking out the window. "Your truck was too clean for a real contractor. But I didn't fall in love with some empire. I fell in love with the guy who fixed my front door and let Elio talk his ear off about dinosaurs. The guy who always let me have the last bite of dessert, even when I said I didn't want it. That's who I married." He swallowed hard. "That guy isn't worth much anymore." She turned, leaning against the sill. "Good. Then I won't have to worry about your mother trying to bribe me again." A short, sharp laugh escaped him. She stepped toward him, voice softer now. "You don't have to save anything, Calloway. We can start over. Really start over. No family money. No company. No expectations." Something in him cracked open. He had spent so long trying to prove he was more than his name, more than his inheritance, more than the weight of his mother's expectations. And now, here was Ophelia, telling him he could be something else entirely. Something new. He looked at her, searching her face, trying to understand how, after everything, she still believed in him. You do that? He asked. Start over with me? She held his gaze. We don't need any of it. We never did. The next day, he called his lawyers. It didn't take long to sell what was left. The investors were gone, but the assets still had value, and the pieces of his old life disappeared in a matter of weeks. The house, the office, the rental properties, it all went, one by one, until the only thing left was whatever came next. They moved to a small town an hour outside the city, to a place with a single main street and a diner that still served coffee for $1. Calloway found a small commercial space on the edge of town, and with the last of his savings, he opened a workshop. Nothing fancy, just a place where he could take on custom projects, things built with his own hands instead of his name. Ophelia took a job at a local bookstore. They rented a little house with a leaky faucet and floors that creaked exactly the way they were supposed to. It wasn't glamorous. But it was theirs. Months passed. Calloway woke up early every morning, had coffee with Ophelia on the back steps while the sky turned pink, then spent the day in his workshop. Ophelia brought Elio by after school, and he would sit at the workbench, playing with scrap wood and making little models of dinosaurs. For the first time in his life, Calloway wasn't running towards something or away from it. He was just here. One evening, after dinner, Elio climbed onto the couch beside him and handed him a book. Mom says you should read to me. Calloway smiled, adjusting the kid under his arm. She does, huh? Elio nodded. She says it builds character. Calloway grinned and opened the book. Halfway through, Elio let out a long yawn and curled closer against him, eyelids drooping. Calloway turned the page, expecting him to fall asleep, but then. Good night, Dad. The words were soft. Sleepy. Thoughtless. Calloway went completely still. Elio had never called him that before. Ophelia glanced up from the other side of the room, eyes meeting his over the top of her book. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Later, when Elio was tucked in bed and the house was quiet, Calloway sat on the edge of their bed, running a hand over his face. Ophelia slipped behind him, arms wrapping around his waist, her chin resting against his shoulder. You okay? He nodded. You don't look okay, she teased. He let out a shaky breath, voice rough. He called me Dad. She smiled against his shoulder. Yeah. He did. Calloway swallowed hard. You think he meant it? She squeezed him tighter. I think he's been waiting to say it. He let out a slow exhale, leaning into her, letting himself belong in a way he never had before. He had spent years thinking freedom meant walking away. But this was what it meant to be free. Miles away, in a city they had left behind, Ianthe sat in a high-rise apartment, sipping wine, watching the lights flicker below. Her son had made his choice. But she had never been the kind of woman who accepted defeat.